The President and the Shah met for about an hour this morning. The President said the Shah's visit was encouraging and had strengthened the strong ties of friendship between the two countries.
Fundamentalism took hold with a fury and a force that helped ignite the still impoverished masses in Iran, who felt they had little reason to be grateful to the Shah.
It was just a few minutes ago that the word reached here on Shah Reza Street that the Shah had finally left the country.
A public signal that the U.S. had decided the Shah must go was actually given last Thursday by State Department spokesman Harding Carter, who indicated for the first time that the basic policy of the U.S. was not the continuation of the Shah's reign.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students.
The Iranians had fought U.S. Marine Guards for 3 hours for control of the embassy. The American hostages were blindfolded, handcuffed, and marched out on the U.S. Embassy's front steps by the revolutionary students.
The militants controlling the embassy have stated they are willing to turn the hostages over to the government of Iran. But the government has refused to take custody of the American hostages.
After 156 days, the United States is breaking diplomatic relations with Iran.
Must pay increasingly heavy costs now. The president ordered 4 steps immediately. A complete break in diplomatic relations. Iranian diplomats must leave the United States by tomorrow midnight. Official sanctions prohibiting exports to Iran. The exporting of even food and medicine is expected to be minimal or non-existent. An inventory of frozen Iranian assets of over $8 billion in this country, and steps toward using the money to pay claims of Americans against Iran. And a virtual shutting off of all Iranian immigration into this country by refusing new visas to Iranian citizens.
Just before Mr. Carter got to Andrews Air Force Base for his trip home to Plains, the hostages' departure was officially confirmed. They had taken off about a half an hour after he was no longer president.
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter until the hearings were over.
That action involved profits of up to $30 million from U.S. arms sales to Iran being secretly funneled to Contra rebels fighting in Nicaragua.
Good afternoon. The United States this afternoon acknowledged that a missile from an American ship in the Persian Gulf shot down accidentally an Iran Air passenger plane with 290 people on board.
And to suspend nearly all other economic activity between our nations. This is not a step I take lightly, but I am convinced that instituting a trade embargo with Iran is the most effective way our nation can help to curb that nation's drive to acquire devastating weapons and its continued support for terrorism.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom.
A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
2 commercial tankers suffered damage while moving through international waters in the Gulf of Oman.
That the American people will soon find out if the United States is going to war with Iran, saying the regime made a very big mistake shooting down a U.S. military surveillance drone like the one you see on your screen.
A rocket attack on the Baghdad airport kills Iran's most revered military leader and a senior official in Iraq's paramilitary forces.
The way in which the U.S. has weaponized international trade against Iran is deeply ingrained in its foreign policy objectives, the two countries' histories, and their mutual distrust for each other. The history starts with this man, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was the popular and democratically elected leader of Iran, and he believed his country's greatest strategic resource was their large oil reserves, which were at the time controlled by foreign private companies. In 1951, Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry because of what he saw as exploitation of his country's resources from Western colonialists. This led to foreign countries excluding Iran from the international oil market, and Iran's economy suffered tremendously. Then in 1953, the CIA led a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government and installed the Shah, an exiled monarch. The reason for the coup is still debated today by political scientists, but many believe it was to prevent the spread of communism. The Shah's government and the U.S. shared a prosperous relationship. The U.S. needed military allies in the Middle East to combat the USSR's growing influence, and Iran purchased billions of dollars of military equipment from the U.S. Many characterized the Shah's reign as one of tyranny, oppression, and erosion of human rights. The Savak was a secret police force helped establish by the CIA that was known to kill and torture political dissidents. In 1979, there was a revolution against the Shah, and the U.S. decided to abandon its support in favor of the new government led by Ayatollah Khamenei. Under this new government, tensions between the U.S. and Iran flared. The Iranian hostage crisis was the beginning, and the Iran-Contra affair was seen as another act of U.S. duplicity, where the U.S. was happy to supply Iran with weapons, but would later intervene on behalf of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. During the Carter administration was the first time the U.S. began to weaponize its economy against Iran. The U.S. froze $12 billion of Iranian assets, prohibited most exports, and suspended all immigration. Then in 1988, the U.S. accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger plane and refused to apologize. This is part of a long list of transgressions that the Iranian government has against the U.S. In the 2000s, Iran began aggressively pursuing the creation of nuclear weapons. It became a foreign policy priority of the U.S. to prevent that from happening. They increased sanctions and in 2010 launched the computer virus Stuxnet into Iranian computer systems. The virus caused significant damage to the Iranian nuclear program. Under the Obama administration, Iran came to the negotiating table and bartered a partial dismantling of their nuclear program in exchange for relief from U.S. sanctions. More on this later. The U.S. often uses its economic mass to achieve its foreign policy goals, and the U.S.'s economy is almost 50 times the size of Iran's. In large part, the sanctions that have been placed on Iran are directly because of their attempt to develop nuclear weapons. In 2005, when Iran began enriching uranium, the U.S. pressured the UN to place sanctions on Iran and did so. UN member states agreed not to provide Iran any nuclear-related technologies and froze any assets related to the nuclear program. They also offered economic incentives if they would freeze their nuclear program, but they were quickly dismissed by Iran. While the sanctions were officially aimed at delaying the nuclear program, which experts claim it did so with great effect, the Iranian people suffered greatly under them. Essentials such as food and medicine became more difficult to obtain. The economic hardship on the people of Iran is also indirectly aimed at their policymakers, who will be pressured by the Iranian people into dealing with the economic hardship. Iran relies on its main export to keep its economy rolling, oil. The sanctions made it difficult to export a resource that their economy relies so heavily upon. This had a cascading effect on their economy, and living standards of all classes decreased. Due to embargoes on the US and European companies Boeing and Airbus, Iran has been unable to purchase new aircraft or parts for their existing aircraft. This has given Iran an extremely poor commercial safety record for air travel. In a 2018 Human Rights Watch report, they concluded that US sanctions were harming Iranian citizens' right to health. The report states, though the US government has built exemptions for humanitarian imports into its sanctions, the broad US sanctions against Iranian banks, coupled with aggressive rhetoric from U.S. officials, has drastically constrained Iran's ability to finance such humanitarian imports. The sanctions have been correlated with deep recessions in the Iranian economy. One Iranian tells me, everything you'd expect to happen really happens. Prices soar, widespread unemployment, food shortages, increased human trafficking, drug trafficking, theft, etc. The U.S. sanctions had no impact on the U.S.'s economy. The U.S. is nearly energy independent, and there are existing international frameworks to keep the production of oil in a place where Iran's drop in exports will have no effect. Under immense economic pressure, Iran finally came to the negotiating table under the Obama administration. The deal between the P5+1, which is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, agreed to limit Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons in exchange for relief from almost all sanctions. The U.S. was able to achieve its foreign policy objective of removing the nuclear threat in Iran through the expense of almost nothing but time. The U.S. has the vast passive resource of its economy when conducting foreign policy, and it uses it to its strength. The current administration has been using this passive ability in abundance by attempting to renegotiate trade deals and amend international treaties. The U.S., in an attempt to maintain its global hegemony, cannot allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. When a country obtains nuclear weapons, its ability to exert direct and indirect influence increases substantially. The U.S. has a delicate position in the Middle East and wants to maintain the current balance of power between Iran and Saudi Arabia, where neither of them are much stronger than the other. This has been a frequent theme in the United States' Middle Eastern foreign policy, preventing any nation from dominating the region so as to force the individual countries to look for outside support in an attempt to gain regional hegemony. The U.S. needs Iran in this way, because without Iran to rival Saudi Arabia in the region, Saudi Arabia would not need the U.S. Iran and Saudi Arabia have a history equally as long and complex as the U.S., and most conflicts in the Middle East have these two countries at odds with each other. If Iran was to obtain nuclear weapons, the balance of power between these two countries would shift, and it could have a lasting and unfavorable impact for the U.S. on the political landscape in the Middle East. The denuclearization of Iran is a U.S. major foreign policy goal, and it has spanned nearly 30 years and 5 presidential administrations. The U.S. holds strong influence amongst the international level of politics and was able to barter its way into placing near worldwide sanctions on Iran. When Donald Trump withdrew from that deal, Iran's economy suffered in a way that it never had before. It also resumed its development of nuclear weapons. According to a Pew Research Center poll, 53% of the American public and 94% of U.S. scholars in international relations disapprove of Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear weapons agreement. Iran also sees it as another act of U.S. duplicity. The U.S. has overthrown their government, deceived and betrayed them at every opportunity, and used its economic might to cripple their economy. When Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry and took it away from the Western countries, the U.S. toppled his regime and replaced him with the brutal and tyrannical Shah. When his government was overthrown, the U.S. was quick to drop their once ally and attempted to befriend the new government. The U.S. funded Iran's military during the Iran-Iraq War, but later intervened on behalf of Iraq when the balance of power shifted towards Iran. When the U.S. downplayed the Iran-Contra deal, it was seen as a slap in the face to Iran. Then, when the two countries have finally come to a good faith agreement, the U.S. abruptly pulls out, reinstates even harsher sanctions, and sends their economy spiraling. In conclusion, in accordance to the U.S.'s broader Middle Eastern strategy, they cannot allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. To do so, the U.S. used their large economic mass and its strong international influence to force harsh sanctions on Iran. The ensuing economic pressure forced Iran to negotiate with the U.S. and the UN, and they eventually came to a deal which fulfilled the U.S. foreign policy goal. The current administration does not trust that Iran will keep their side of the deal, so they preemptively pulled out and once again is putting massive pressure on the Iranian economy. Iran feels bullied and backed into a corner, and that feeling is reflected by their government's policy and their people's attitude towards America. Iran has resumed its transgressions against the U.S. by shooting down their drones, firing on their military bases, and sabotaging oil tankers. Just 10% of Iranians look favorably upon the U.S. Though Iran is not innocent, the current regime is characterized by its authoritarian attitude and its human rights abuses. Iran would likely act in a similar fashion as the U.S. if the roles were reversed. And it is important to note that there is currently nationwide protests in which over 1,500 people have been killed. For now, peace between these two nations is nearly impossible because of the immense leverage the U.S. holds, the cancerous distrust between them, and the two countries' pure unwillingness to solve the problem at hand.